Hey, good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 1. I'm on Chapter 13 in the American Yelp, and it's about the sectional crisis. We know we're going to lead up to the Civil War that begins in 1860, uh, but it really begins at almost the inception of our nation. Really, the Revolutionary War brings out some of the undercurrents of the tension over the slave owning uh, areas of the nation and those that aren't. Now, at the time of the Revolution, nearly the entire country had a slave population, but it was quickly becoming different demographically. The South was more agrarian, and especially with the advent of Whitney's cotton gin. Whitney gets all the credit, but there was other people inventing very similar processes to take the seed out of the cotton to make it more viable as a textile. That changed the South and the southern regions' need for an intensive labor supply. In the North, just didn't have the same economic direct need for slavery. That doesn't mean the North didn't necessarily benefit from the textile production of cotton and rice and other products of the South in terms of being importers and exporters and actual manufacturers of goods that use those raw materials. So, although slavery might not have been nearly as big in the northern region as our country develops, it's still fueled an economic engine that transgressed the entire nation. But nonetheless, the sectional crisis really starts developing deeper and deeper because there, and I thought the book did a really nice job introducing this concept. That is, many Northern workers felt that slavery suppressed wages because if there wasn't for slavery, there'd be more economic competition to pay people reasonable wages. Because of that, slavery basically undercut the working person's advocacy for better wages. And it also stole land that could have been used by poor white Americans to achieve economic independence and success in their own right. So that's part of the argument of why there was regional strife over the expansion of slavery. It wasn't necessarily over the existence of slavery. A lot of people think, well, the North got this humanitarian awakening call and they recognized slavery was wrong and they wanted to end it and the South wanted to preserve it. It's much bigger than that. The North didn't necessarily at that juncture, at least not in broad numbers, necessarily want to end the institution of slavery in the southern states that had it. They were more concerned about the expansion of it because there was a concern that the southern interest were becoming dominant in the federal government, and therefore the Southern slavery interest would somehow take over Northern interest in the Congress and in the Senate. Well, Congress is both the Senate and the House, but you get my drift there between the bicameral legislature. So these kind of tensions were brewing very early on in our nation's history, and plus our own American Revolution brought out these ideals that human existence has certain inalienable rights for all people, and it was a great hypocrisy in the sense that we allowed slavery to not only exist, but to be legally recognized in our country, created a great deal of tension right from the birth of our nation. Then some of the things that came up also was there was a new philosophical movement over in Europe about anti-slavery. Ironically, that's where it's born out of. Slavery is brought here by the Europeans, and it's also the movement against slavery and the identity of it being an immoral institution was also born in Europe and transported back over to the continent of the United States. And that was becoming a tension that was definitely part of the philosophical mindset was changing over the concepts of slavery. It's called the Transatlantic Anti-Slavery Movement. It started arguing that freedom was a natural condition for all humankind, and that undercuts the entire institution of slavery, suggesting these are an inferior people and some people are meant for slavery. It's in the Bible, for crying out loud. A lot of the people in the southern states that supported slavery tried to argue its existence for some people of an inferior race, and it was appropriate. But this new philosophical undercurrent really started rising a tide against slavery, especially in the Northeast. And then there's a big event, and there's other events besides those that occur in the United States, and one of them's in Haiti. That's French, the big Napoleonic, basically Napoleon ends his interest basically in the New World because of the loss of Haiti. Haiti was basically a slave revolt, and what's most interesting about that is not only is it a slave revolt that sends shuddering repercussions throughout the United States, but it's the recognition that these now revolting slaves run their own country. And that basically did away with a great myth that Southern slave owners tried to argue for the longest time, that these people can't govern themselves. They really don't know what to do with freedom. They can't be an autonomous people on their own. They can't participate in civic life or in society as equals or in their own right because they're inferior. The Haitian Revolution undercut that entire argument because basically rebellious slaves took over their own land and ran it successfully. And so that was a huge repercussion in the South, and it actually created a more strangled, if you will, type of slavery here in the South because the concerns of revolt became very, very real. And so therefore Southern slavery became more rigid, more brutal, and not that slavery ever can be good, but it certainly was a change in the way in which Southern plantationers, often outnumbered by the slave community, there was real concerns about revolt, and that's what the Haitian Revolution did, was spread that concern, and that information got to slaves. They might well revolt, and so therefore entrenched the power structure of white slave owners over slaves and creating a intolerable set of conditions. So the potential for revolt couldn't even arise. We also know that there were some formerly there were freed blacks, Americans. They weren't considered Americans. We'll talk about the Dred Scott decision momentarily, but there were many blacks that fought, or African Americans, if you want to use that term, that fought during the Revolutionary War against Britain, and they had free status, and they became successful. They became educated, and they became architects of making philosophical arguments against the institution of slavery. Frederick Douglass being a perfect example. Once a slave, escaped slave, became educated and rallied and moved to the North as an escaped slave, and he rallied against the institution of slavery in the most eloquent and clear-minded arguments known to humankind, and that undercut the very conception that African Americans were somehow an inferior people. So that undercurrent also is creating a tension in the continuation of slavery. But you got to remember, in this early stages, before the actual Civil War, there wasn't much of an argument about freeing slaves in those slave states that already existed. It's much more about the new lands that were coming into the country, both from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, but also the Mexican War that ends in 1848, although we got Texas slightly before then, but we get more than Texas now. We get all the way to California, Utah, Nevada, even into Wyoming. All of these lands come in, and then the question becomes, because there's a tension over if it's a free state, well, the North or the Northern interests would have more power in the legislature, at that time, the most important body politic of the three branches. And then the Southern states, if they got a slave state, slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of adding them into the census, and therefore slave states would become dominant in the federal government. And that tension grew and grew and grew as these new lands became part of the states. And it wasn't always about, the Northern argument wasn't always about equity and fairness for African Americans. It was often very racist, like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. They actually created out certain black laws. Their black laws of 1803 basically said blacks couldn't come here free. Wasn't that but they didn't want to have slavery because they were concerned about the slave interest getting power, but they didn't want equality for African Americans. That philosophical advent didn't become much broader until really at the closure of the Civil War. Matter of fact, these laws often banned African Americans from voting, denied Black Americans access to public schools, and made it impossible for non-whites to serve on juries and local militias, and among a host of other restrictions and obstacles. And those are in the free states. So if there was a free African American, they might be able to go there, but they didn't want them there. And if they were allowed to go there, they really didn't get to participate in civic life. We knew as these new lands started coming into from the western regions of the Louisiana Purchase, the tensions over whether they be slave or free kept coming to a boil. We know you might have a test question on it, but you should know about the Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment said, yeah, we'll take Missouri in as a state, no problem, but we want to put in a sunset provision where slavery will ultimately die out. Those currently in bondage might stay in bondage, but their children at the age of 21 will become emancipated, something like that. There was a provision that would actually cause the institution of slavery to end in Missouri over a given period of time. Wildly popular in the North, hated in the South, and it died because the South had enough power in the legislature to make sure it didn't go through. So the debate about how do we bring Missouri in created the water's really simmering. We're coming to a boiling point. People in Missouri, many of them wanted it to be a free state. Others wanted it to be a slave state. But it was more the rest of the country that was concerned because the balance of power in the legislature would be tilted because of these regional interests and philosophies over the expansion of slavery were very distinct. And so the first, it's called the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay, the hero of Abraham Lincoln, when I was a kid kind of growing up, he was called the Great Compromiser. And sometimes there's a lot to be said with compromise. And arguably through Henry Clay and others' efforts, we avoided civil war for probably a good 60, 70 years. But anyways, in 1819, it was the Missouri Compromise. And the ultimate compromise there was they're going to let Missouri to come in as a slave state. North is outraged. But here's the compromise. Maine was Massachusetts land, believe it or not, or territory of Massachusetts. I don't know how you figure that all out, but Maine becomes a state as well. One's free, one's slave. The balance of power in the legislature stays the same. And that compromise didn't make everyone shout for joy, except those that love peace. There was a recognition that the simmering water basically got taken off the burner, and things did quiet down for a period of time. And Henry Clay was the compromiser of that, the great architect of it. And here's the weird part: is the southern border of Missouri would basically be the demarcation line for future slavery. South of it, areas in Texas and like that, would be open to slavery. Areas north of that would ban slavery, except for Missouri itself. So Missouri is going to be this little cutout in the non-slave area. But at this juncture in 1819, when the Missouri Compromise passed, it was a well-settled outlook that almost all Americans concluded that the Constitution protected slavery as it already existed. This isn't about ending slavery in the southern states that had it. It's about whether or not it's going to be allowed in these new expansive territories. You got to remember the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States, and as a result of the treaty with Mexico after the Mexican-American War in 1848, we almost had another third of the country. It's like we're expanding so rapidly that it's about these new regions. Are they going to be slave? Are they going to be free? Because the regional tensions over that question become paramount to all political thought, really between 1819 and right up into the start of the Civil War. Yeah, and I'm glad I found this right here. It says the question of whether or not new territories be slave or free became the all-encompassing referendum on the American past, present, and future. It was that big a deal. And then there was a couple of slave revolts. One of the more famous one was a guy by the name of Denmark Cecily. He led the slave revolt in the Carolinas. It got crushed, but many white slave owners were killed during that period of time, and it sent shockwaves to the South, which made even more stringent slave control a part of the institution of slavery in the South. Made it much more even draconian than it already was, or brutal, if you will. And now the Democratic Party becomes somewhat split between the North and the South. Some of the Northern Democrats are anti-expansion of slavery, where the Southern Democrats are for keep Texas and the Western regions free for slavery. Talk about an oxymoron. Keep something free for slavery. In Andrew Jackson, we know Andrew Jackson at the period of time expanded democracy significantly, and the Democratic Party was basically advocating expansion of the nation in terms of manifest destiny going west. And I'm just trying to see what as things go. And then we know a new political party came out as a result of this, and the new political party is the Whigs. The Whigs are basically just anti-Jacksonian, but they are often part of their makeup is anti-slavery. There is another party that develops that doesn't really take any kind of real control, but it does have enough power to sway between the Whigs and the Democrats, and the so-called American Party doesn't quite ever take off in any real way. The Whigs become, their whole purpose is, and the reason why they're called the Whigs was that was the name of a party in Great Britain that was anti-monarchy. And Jackson, as a president, was so strong and powerful in the executive that they adopted the name Whigs to basically suggest that they're against, a tyrannical power within one individual like Andrew Jackson. And upon Andrew Jackson's leaving office, the Whigs begin to collapse, but they fragment and they ultimately delve into some other parties. One's called the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers are an argument that we're going to campaign that any new lands ever adopted by the United States become free. That's the Free Soil Party. I used to think the Free Soil Party, when I first took history class, because I wasn't that engaged, I thought the Free Soil Party was about giving Western lands for free to future pioneers. I didn't realize it had anything to do with slavery. I was kind of naive, and I didn't do a lot of homework. But you get my drift, that it's an important principle. And we know the controversy over Texas, why Texas stayed as a republic of its own for 10 years and didn't get adopted in the United States, was over northern concerns that Texas would come in as a slave state. It wasn't about whether or not Texas, which was made up mostly of Americans, because Americans settled there for a period of time, ultimately revolt against Mexico. They become a republic. We recognize them. They want to become part of the United States, and most Americans want them in the United States. But the question is, again, over slavery. And then a huge case comes down that was one of the big disturbing developments you should know about, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a freedom law, basically recognizing the freedom of escaped slaves. The United States had a fugitive law. And so basically the question is, could Pennsylvania law trump federal law? And we know through basic constitutional analysis today that obviously federal law is supreme. So it struck down these states' freedom laws. And so the federal government's Fugitive Slave Act trumped Pennsylvania's personal liberty law, and therefore Southern authorities or the federal government could come into the state of Pennsylvania and basically round up escaped slaves over the objection of the state law of Pennsylvania. That created a great deal of tension. And it's ironic that the South later will argue that the Civil War was over states' rights, but the South were actually trying to interfere in Northern state principles in their state legislation. So it's not always about states' rights. It depends upon whether the cause fits the argument of state rights, or is it about nationalism. So Prigg versus Pennsylvania is a big one. But we know these other people that were once slaves became very articulate advocates for showing that they are just as human as everybody else. And obviously, I already talked about Frederick Douglass and his life and his advocacy, but other former slaves such as Sojourner Truth and other free Black Americans gave speeches throughout the land, especially North, not the South. They weren't going to be speaking. But they attacked the fugitive slave law by helping thousands escape, and the Underground Railroad developed. I was on a tour one time when I was in high school, and we visited a location which was part of the Underground Railroad. And one of the students wanted to know if there were any of the trains left or any of the tracks we could view. The Underground Railroad is a it's a metaphor. There's no rail as part of it. What it is basically a series of networks of people that wanted to help escaped slaves find freedom either here in the United States or ultimately go all the way up to Canada. And we know the big one is Harriet Tubman, which was really responsible for being an unbelievable advocate for freeing. She herself was an African-American former slave, but she worked diligently to help this Underground Railroad process. And did it rankle the South? Yeah, because the South is saying these people are basically undercutting the law. The law is that fugitive slaves need to be returned. They're doing just the opposite. They're trying to help free slaves. So these tensions between the North and the South keep developing over slavery and freed slaves. Now later, because of these new lands are coming in, different people in government try to advocate different positions to help settle the problem, or actually throw gas on the fire in terms of tension. And one of them is the famous Wilmot provision. David Wilmot was a congressman, and he advocated in 1846 banning the expansion of slavery into the territories won from Mexico, because ultimately in 1848 we're going to come up with a settlement. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to have that settlement. Wilmot says, hey, great, we're going to do it. We're going to allow them to come in the country. We're going to adopt all these lands as long as they're free. It passed the House. That potential law passed the House. The Senate blocked it. But what did it do? it created greater tensions between the North and the South because the argument over the institution of slavery is spreading. This wasn't the argument over ending slavery or the merits of slavery. It was just about the expansion or the non-expansion of slavery. Later, it develops into an argument over the institution itself. Even Lincoln, when he's running, he even entertained right up into the eve of the Civil War, creating an amendment to the United States Constitution that would be unamendable. I don't know how you do that, but they would create an amendment basically recognizing slavery in those southern states that had it as an institution and only allowing slavery to be, I guess, tampered with through law in these new Western territories. Even Lincoln was for that. A lot of people think Lincoln was a huge abolitionist who wanted to end slavery. He evolves into that, but initially on, he recognized that Southern slavery was a legal institution, and he wasn't trying to tamper with it because his goal of preserving the Union, at least initially, was much more important than the ending the entire institution of slavery. Yeah, free soil, free labor, free men. That was one of the big parties, had some success, not in terms of the presidency, but the Free Soilers got enough votes and enough members into Congress and one in the Senate, which is Salmon Chase, who later serves Lincoln as secretary. No, he wasn't Secretary of State because that was Seward, but he serves in a very important position in the Lincoln cabinet. Team of Rivals, if you ever read it, by Doris Kearns Goodwin. He was an Ohio senator, but he was a Free Soiler. That was the party he had. And Free Soilers are what? Basically, we're all for Manifest Destiny expanding the country, but we want all new lands to come in to be basically slave-free. They weren't necessarily advocating for ending slavery where it already existed, just no more further expansion. And it gives, look at the Mexican cession. All these lands, we've got California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, a chunk of Colorado, a chunk of Wyoming, and we know Texas itself, although already a republic 10 years earlier, all of those lands come in, which expanded the country's footprint significantly. Yeah, in Congress, Free Soilers members had enough votes to swing power to either the Whigs or the Democrats. Unfortunately, the Whigs never had a very cohesive message politically, other than being anti-Jacksonian. And so they're going to fall apart very shortly after the next few elections. And we know all these different tensions keep developing, and then we get California, and now we've got to come to some new compromises. What are we going to do with these new lands? Some people say, well, it should be, and you should know this term, popular sovereignty. Basically, we'll bring in the new lands, and we'll let the people who are going to occupy those lands create a new state constitution, and they'll determine whether they want to be a free or a slave state. Others are saying we can't leave it to that because that's going to create other huge turmoil, which it does in Kansas, Nebraska. Get to that one second. So these debates are going on and on. Henry Clay is still part of the manufacturer of the Missouri Compromise, but now we have the Compromise of 1850. It's not one law, it's a series of laws. One of them, to appease the Southern interest, is they're going to really jack up the fugitive slave law with steroids. Not only will it allow federal authorities, but it'll demand and require people within their state to help capture freed slaves. And if they don't, they could be charged with a violation of the fugitive slave law. And talk about a corrupt law. Not only was it immoral in the first place, but it gave the magistrates that would rule in this no jury trial. The alleged escaped slave couldn't produce evidence or testify on their behalf, so that's bad enough. What's even worse is the magistrate would be paid $10 if they were make a finding that this person wasn't actually a escaped slave, and they would only be paid $5 if they said no, they were actually a legitimately freed African American person. Terrible, terrible law. But that was part of the next compromise we have over these new territories gained after the American and Mexican War. And there's a series of them. One of them is Mexico and Utah would be part of popular sovereignty. They would get to decide whether or not they're going to be a free state or a slave state. We know Texas is going to come in as a slave state, very unpopular in the North. But California would be a free state. And California just never fit in terms of having a great deal of demand for slavery in it anyways. So, and Henry Clay, being the brilliant man he was, recognized that slavery probably should always have been looked at in terms of regional interest. The Northeast didn't want slavery anymore because they didn't really have a big need for it. They recognized California probably wouldn't have a lot of slavery because there wasn't a need for it. It wasn't that kind of southern heavy agricultural labor that was intensely needed. So he almost thought there was a sort of natural determination about whether or not something should be slave or free. Now, Douglas, who was a big unionist, a lot of people think, Stephen Douglas, who ran against Lincoln in the election of 58 for the Senate, they're also going to run against each other for president. Lincoln loses that race, but it's all about whether or not the expansion of slavery should be allowed in new territories or not, and whether the new states could control the question. Does the federal government have any say in it? And those debates gave Lincoln a national prominence in the abolitionist movement in terms of not allowing the expansion of slavery in these new areas. And Stephen A. Douglas was much more about popular sovereignty. It should be up to the people that live in those jurisdictions. Douglas wins the election for the Senate, but he's going to lose the election for the presidency because the Democratic Party becomes split. It's coming up in a second. But what does he propose in the meantime and gets through Congress? Something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nebraska is this big chunk of territory. He wants to block it off into two states. One's going to be Nebraska, the other's going to be Kansas, and he's going to basically say it's by popular sovereignty. The problem with that is the anti-slavery movement in terms of expansion and the pro-slavery expansion movement is so strong that guess what happens? They pour in militant advocates for both sides to say, I now live in Kansas, and they want to vote for the new Constitution. Initially, the people vote that it's going to be a free state. The federal government refuses to recognize that vote because of Southern interests that had power with the president, not Fillmore, but Buchanan. And so they don't recognize it. And there's a fraudulent legislature that says, no, we want to be a slave state. And that's the one the federal government's willing to recognize. And what does Kansas turn into? A bloodbath. There's literally civil war, physical violence going on in Kansas. People are murdering each other. And one of the more famous people is John Brown. John Brown is a wicked abolitionist. He wants to end slavery at any cost. So when he hears about some of the atrocities that pro-slavery forces have done, killing some anti-slavery forces, he goes down and butchers and massacres a group of pro-slavery people before he leaves and goes to where? Well, he goes to the federal arsenal on the East Coast, Harper's Ferry, and he tries to create a revolution with freed blacks and other whites that were against abolition. They get crushed, they get wiped out. His sons all die in that battle, most of them. He survives only to be executed later, and during the process, he becomes a martyr for the anti-slavery movement. The real issue about John Brown, and those who are really interested about this guy, he was actually a lunatic. There was something wrong with him. It was nuts. But the irony of it is he had moments of clarity during the trial against him, and when he was being executed, was the most eloquent speaker against slavery that one could imagine. So he becomes a martyr for the North. He becomes a traitor and a madman in the Southern slavery view. And the truth, a little bit on both sides on that thing. So the Fugitive Slave Act, we know, created a foundation for massive expansion of federal power, including increasing the nation's police powers. Many black Northerners, or white Northerners, hated it. And so did many black Northerners. Many of them moved to Canada as a result, for fear that although they were legitimately free, that somebody would come in and take them and say, hey, you're an escaped slave. No, I'm not. And difficulty of proof in that era was probably pretty difficult for fear of being potentially put back into some kind of servitude, moved to Canada. And so it's ripping the nation apart, and the Democratic Party ultimately gets ripped apart. And so in the election of 1860, the Democratic Party refuses to support a Northern candidate. The Democratic Party becomes split, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, although some of them have sympathy on both sides. The Southern Democrats nominate the vice president from Kentucky. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. He obviously doesn't win. But they have a second convention, the Northern Democrats, and they support Stephen A. Douglas. Democratic Party is so split, almost anybody from the newly formed Republican Party, former Whigs, former Free Soilers, other groups that come together to create a newborn party called the Republican Party, they nominate Lincoln, not because he was necessarily everyone's first choice, it's just he was the least controversial of the national players. And we know what happens. Lincoln is ultimately going to win, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act really opens up the country. They called it Bloody Kansas. And we're really going to have a war over it. And then we have the famous Dred Scott decision. And I thought it came up earlier. Now it comes up it comes up on the eve of the Civil War, 1858, actual decision. Dred Scott's a really awful decision. But after Buchanan wins the election, he actually does something very unethical. He actually lobbies the Supreme Court behind closed doors. He's pretty good friends with Roger Taney, a state rights pro-slavery guy. And he basically says, we need to bring a case. Let's do something in a case and settle this whole slavery expansion question once and for all. And Buchanan probably thinks it'll quiet the nation by doing this because we're almost at civil war now in Kansas. So the case comes up with Dred Scott. Dred Scott is an African-American slave, but he lives for a period of time in a free territory. And in many court rulings previously, that if a slave was brought to a free territory and lived there as a resident for a period of time, they gained their autonomy, their freedom. And so that's what Dred Scott sued for back in his home state. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Roger Taney's waiting for the case. Roger Taney, it's not just him, but the entire Supreme Court take a look at this case, and they make a couple rulings, and I didn't think the book did a good job of this. One ruling is, you're not even a citizen, you're not even a person, you don't even have standing to bring a claim, so you can't even sue, so forget about you. That's pretty bad in and of itself. But then it goes on to talk about how African Americans are an inferior people, so they can never attain citizenship because they're really not human beings on the same level. So it's an extremely racist opinion. Most people vilify it extensively, but what's more important is the political question that comes out of it. Roger Taney and the Supreme Court ruled that because Dred Scott isn't a person, he's actually property. And the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects property. And so if you own this cup, or if I own that lamp behind me, or this phone, but it wouldn't be in 1857 or 58, what am I free to do with my property? I'm free to possess it, I'm free to own it, and the government has to recognize those interests and can't take away my property without just compensation. And so what it ultimately did was saying it would be unconstitutional for the federal government to ban slavery in any district because it would be banning me, say I'm a southern Georgia slave owner, it'd be banning me from taking my slaves like any other property in other parts of the nation. So in effect, Dred Scott destroyed the legal merits of the Compromise of 1850, destroyed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, destroyed the Compromise of 1890, basically really nationalized slavery again. And then the debates in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it's not for president, it's for the Senate, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they argued that, well, the federal government still could get involved. It just required just compensation. But it fell flat. It really made the northern abolitionist movements and the I don't want to call them abolitionists because some of them didn't want to end slavery. They just didn't want it to move into the new Western territories. It outraged them. The North was convinced that the South had controlled the federal government and the courts, and it was just really outrageous. And so the tensions are rising and rising and rising. Democratic Party splits over this rising tensions. Poor Stephen A. Douglas can't win, even though he's probably the most, would have probably walked into office if he had won. He loses, but and one thing about Stephen A. Douglas you got to give him credit for, even though he loses, he doesn't advocate for secession in the southern states. He actually suggests that the Union needs to be preserved, and he wants the nation to rally behind Lincoln, the guy he loses to. Lincoln wins, and as a result of him winning, he's viewed as an abolitionist. He's really not an abolitionist. What he is he's anti-expansion of slavery. And because of that, though, the South say, oh, no, that's too much of a risk to our entire institution. It's too much of a risk to our Southern economy. It's too much of a risk to our institutions as we know them to be. We are going to leave the Union. The Union we join voluntarily. We should be able to freely leave from. South Carolina is the first one to do it. They write up articles of succession. Other states join in. Texas, Mississippi, I forgot all this. Not all of them. Not all the slave states actually do it. But it's not a war yet. This is when Buchanan is lame duck in his presidency. He's done. He's not. What does he do about the succession? Nothing. And that's why when people ask, what's the worst president ever, it's easy to pick on Buchanan, not only because he basically railroaded the Dred Scott decision through by lobbying the Supreme Court to rule in a certain way, but more importantly, he basically sat back and said, well, we'll figure something out. It'll become, because there was no shots fired at all. Lincoln becomes the president. He gives his big a conciliation speech at his inauguration, talking about how a house divided cannot stand. We got to bring the nation back together. and ultimately South Carolina will fire the first shots on Fort Sumner. And then the Civil War is going to begin, and other southern states join the Confederacy. Some stay with the Union, and that's what's ironic is we actually have some slave states, in theory, fighting for the Union. I kind of was all over the place, but it's a great book, great chapter. I wish they talked a little bit more about the Dred Scott decision, because it made it sound like it was just a really unfortunate decision in that it talked about the ruling that African Americans could never be citizens. And although I think that's a very important part of the decision, the bigger part of the decision was it basically scraps the Compromise of 1850, which was keeping the nation at peace, if not in open hostility. The Kansas-Nebraska Act probably brought out open hostilities, but the Dred Scott decision left the nation with a real question about whether or not slavery was open to the entire country now. It's huge. Anyways, my little video for what it's worth. I'll post it up there, and otherwise be well.